Welcome back to the Spiritual Scientist podcast, Terry Boardman. Great to have you here, Terry.
Thanks very much, Mick. It's good to be with you again.
For me too. Actually, Terry, you were one of the first guests I ever had on when I decided to start doing this thing, which I still don't really know what I'm doing. But yeah, that video's had, something like 28,000 views. It's probably the
Mhm.
most popular thing I've done. So thank you for that. But also, it was one of my favorite conversations. So very, very happy to have you back. And I thought
Thank
we
you.
I thought we should just jump straight into current affairs and
Mhm.
talk about what's happening with Iran
Yeah.
and see where we go from there. Because I know that, with your historical understanding and also spiritual understanding, we can end up in all sorts of places. But yeah, what's going on with Iran? What this has been a long-term plan. I mean, I remember Netanyahu talking about Iran's got a nuclear weapon they can have ready within a couple of weeks. He was saying that back in the 90s, So this
Mhm.
is obviously a long-term plan coming to fruition. But yeah, I'm not sure where to start really, but where would you like to start in terms of this theme?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think um, it's quite difficult to really to make sense of it unless we are able to put it in its much larger context. Um, but I think, I mean, since you mentioned nuclear weapons there. Of course, one interesting thing is that the Western media uh, n just about never address the question of Israel's nuclear weapons. So, um, if you have a state like Israel, which historically speaking has suddenly emerged, 1948, in the region, um, then if you then have a power like Iran, which from 1979 changes its nature and becomes an Islamic republic with a very strong focus on solidarity with other Muslim peoples, even though those most of those other Muslim peoples in the region are Sunni Muslims, not Shia like Iran. Nevertheless, strong solidarity with Muslim peoples, then obviously you're going to get a situation in which the the, the people in charge in Iran are going to see Israel um, as a force which has, as it were, muscled into the region with the assistance of Western powers such as Britain and America. And then from the Iranian point of view, again, looking at it post 1979, then they see that somewhere in the 1960s, then the Israelis have obviously gained control of nuclear weapons. So if you are regarding, I'm just looking at this now from the Iranian position, yeah? If you're regarding that what has happened in the Middle East um, to be a crime upon the Muslim peoples, namely the expropriation of land as they saw it, Muslim land. So you have a large population of people, mostly of European origin, who moved to the region mostly after the First World War in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, um, and particularly following the crimes that were perpetrated against the Jews in World War II. But that happened in Europe. And then from the Iranian position, you see all these people then, particularly after World War II, fleeing Europe, moving to Palestine, as it then was. And then the 1947, the partition takes place, which the UN supervises. In 1948, when the British withdrew, then we get the war beginning between the Arabs and the Israelis. And then the lines that were drawn in by the UN in 1947 and supposedly agreed on by the major powers, those go out of the window. And as a result of the struggle between the Israelis and the Arabs, then new lines are drawn, which are drawn to the advantage of the Israelis. So more land is taken than was provided for in the 1947 UN partition plan. And as you know, in 1948, then many Palestinians fled or were ejected from their land, and they went to what is now the West Bank and to Gaza, to the Gaza Strip. So from the Iranian position, you have this entity, as they call it, the Zionist entity, this, or sometimes it's even referred to both by themselves and by other Muslims as a sort of crusader state. In other words, a state which has suddenly appeared in the Middle East from Europe, just as the Crusaders did back in the Middle Ages. Then a criminal event has taken place, the theft of land, so to speak. And this issue of theft of land from 1948 has never really been addressed. And the mainstream media in the West no longer really refer to it. They simply accept the state of Israel as a given. And that then the question for them becomes, well, how can we make peace between this state, which is a given, and the people already there? That's as if to say, well, from the Iranian or the Muslim point of view, somebody has stolen a large part of my property, but I am of our property, our Muslim property, and we are supposed to forget about that and just make peace with these thieves and go on from there. Yeah, and that would certainly be how the Israelis would like to do that, to make peace and go on from there. But from the Muslim point of view, they are not going to accept that, and they haven't accepted it. So then they see the situation where, well, this state which has stolen this land now has a nuclear weapon. So it's entirely understandable that the Iranians would then seek to develop a nuclear weapon themselves, because they might think, well, because we in the Muslim world are opposed to Israel, they have armed themselves with this nuclear weapon and have put themselves in a position of superiority to us, which we can't accept. So they develop a nuclear weapon, and then the allies of Israel, namely particularly America, but also Britain and other West European countries, come in and, as it were, take the side of Israel since 1979. And we saw in 1980 how very soon after the Iranian Islamic Revolution, then America supported Saddam Hussein in that 8-year-long war between Iraq and Iran, which eventually ended in a stalemate. So the question of nuclear weapons, it's never discussed. I don't even hear it mentioned from the United Nations. Well, let's have joint United Nations weapon inspections of both the Israeli and the Iranian nuclear sites. It's always, well, just the Iranian nuclear sites. Nothing's ever said about the Israeli sites, and Israel's never even really accepted or acknowledged that they have nuclear weapons. If you remember back in, I think it was 1986, when that Israeli nuclear technician, Mordecai Vanunu, was abducted in Italy, I think it was, and then by Israeli agents and taken to Israel, put on trial, and then imprisoned. And he had revealed to a British newspaper the existence of the Israeli nuclear weapons program. So now at least the rest of the world knew a little bit about it, but Israel continued basically to stay silent about the question. And the issue of joint inspections, or rather parallel inspections, weapons inspections of both Israeli weapons and Iranian weapons has never really become an issue, which I think it should have been. Then there would have been some kind of parity between the two sides. But that's never happened. It's always, the focus has always been, well, Iran is a dangerous state and Iran must not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, Mick, that doesn't address the original question of the expropriation of the land in the first place and how the state of Israel came about back in the 40s. And that has been like a kind of, well, a serious problem, which not only Israel and Iran, but the whole Western world has never really faced or doesn't want to face now, the question of how Britain and America in particular enabled the state of Israel to come about in 1947, 48. So that's why I think, we're really stuck with this situation at the moment. I mean, would there ever be a possibility that, for example, a new viable state, let's call it, could emerge, whatever the name of it was, in which there were truly equal rights between Jews and Arabs in the place where Israel is now? Would that ever be a possibility? But as you know, they've been arguing for decades about the so-called two-state solution, which I think more and more people are realizing is no longer a viable solution, if indeed it ever was.
Before we continue, just a quick note. Many people discover anthroposophy through books and lectures, podcasts, and conversations like this one. But eventually the question arises, what do I actually do with all of this? How do these ideas become a part of my life? How do they become a practice rather than just simply like this head knowledge that just stays in my head? So that's really the intention behind the school community I've created. It's called the Spiritual Scientist Community. And it's a place online for people who want to study Steiner's work more deeply, develop, their own meditation practice, work with Steiner's ideas, Steiner's exercises as well, and engage with others who are interested in similar things. So if that sounds good to you, it'd be great to see you over there. There is a link in the description below. And so now back to the conversation.
As you know, they've been arguing for decades about the so-called two-state solution, which I think more and more people are realizing is no longer a viable solution, if indeed it ever was. So the Israelis clearly are now thinking, well, we're just going to push the Arabs out. We're going to take over the West Bank. We're going to take over Gaza, and we're going to perhaps even push for the Greater Israel, as many Israelis, not by no means all, of course, but many Israelis are wanting. This is our opportunity, many say, to finally achieve that.
Okay, so there's this problem, which is always a problem with the news cycle, I suppose, that it's just what's happening right now, or often what's actually not happening right now, or a very small window into what's happening, or a biased view of what's happening right now, and never a deep analysis of what's the root of the problem, where it started. So what about this what about this argument that this is the Israeli, this is their homeland, the homeland of the ancient Hebrews, and they have a right to this part of the world and should be able to live there. And that's a lot of the American right. A lot of Republicans are very convinced of that, even in a sort of religious sense, that this belongs to the people of the old what we would say Old Testament. How do we speak to that view? And how do we answer that?
Well, I mean, these are these are certainly really thorny questions. If you were to take that argument seriously, that Jewish people who should be, as it were, allowed to go back to where they were at the time of the expulsions during the Roman Empire, so that's basically back 2,000 years, the first century after Christ. Um, when incidentally, it wasn't the case that, all Jews were expelled at that time. By no means. There were always Jews living in Palestine, but in pretty small numbers. But if it's the case that this particular population are allowed to go back to where they were 2,000 years ago, well, then what about all the other populations in the world who have who have been either forced out or in some way or other forced to move to some other part of the world? Wouldn't they wish to go back to where they want to go back to? Um,
Can you give me an example, Terry, like of another people?
Well, yeah, I mean, for example, say the Welsh were to say, well, we'd like, all the descendants of the Anglo-Saxons to move back to Denmark or Germany, please, so we could, take over England again, which is, well, not England, but I suppose they would call it Cymru then, wouldn't they? Or Britain, yeah, because they were the original population of Britain, at least from about 1,000 before Christ, yeah. Um, and then once the Angles and Saxons arrived, then the Welsh, or again the Cymry, to give them their proper name, were pushed further and further west. And there are many other such examples, I think, in many different parts of the world. Why is it only the Jewish people who are allowed the right to go back to where they were 2,000 years ago, when you consider that so many other people have been living there ever since? And that also begs the question, which has not been scientifically resolved to everybody's satisfaction by any means, about the actual, even physical origins of these people, who indeed are the Israelis. Well, what is the actual origin of the Jewish people who live there in Israel now? There has our origins of many of the Jewish people in Central Asia. That's a debate which has been going on since at least the 1950s. And then others would argue, well, if you really looked into it, you find that that the Palestinians, the people who we call the Palestinian Arabs, are in fact often the original Jews who were living there way back 2,000 years ago, who later converted to Islam and so on. So, it's a very, very complicated historical and genetic question, which has not really been resolved. And that is also the issue of whether in Israel, for example, it's even desired to be resolved one way or the other, yeah, in genetic terms or historical terms. So it doesn't seem reasonable to me that to go back to your original question, that just one population in the world should be allowed to return to where they were 2,000 years ago, but no other population. I mean, if we were to allow that principle, then you would have complete turmoil throughout most of the world. It's just not going to happen. So if you say, well, why is it just this population? Well, that's simply because, as you mentioned, America happens to be as it were, the Roman Empire of our time, the main world power of our time. And in America, you have this very strong Christian Zionist population who, since the 17th century, began to have this idea that it's the obligation of Protestant Christians, seeing as they were mostly Protestant in the American colonies at that time, that the Protestant world, if you will, the Protestant Christian world, is obliged to return the Jews to the Holy Land, because only when that happens, then the Messiah, the Christian Messiah, will return. Yeah? So that depends on the American view of the Jewish people, which is yet another whole thorny issue in itself.
Yeah, so I was gonna, there's a couple of questions I've got around that. So firstly, this maybe it's too much to go into why do the Western powers want to support this nation of Israel in the middle, right in the middle there, amongst all these, well, let's say Arab nations.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and then this question of the religious side of it and how much of it is actually a religious thing and how much of it is just a geopolitical strategic thing. Because I did see Netanyahu the other, I saw a clip, I'm not sure exactly when it was from, but he was talking about, in a way, we need to do this and we need to keep going with the whole Iran thing. Um, and that will, that will lead to the Messiah coming back. I don't know if he's sort of saying this will bring on the Messiah coming, or sorry, not coming back,
Yeah.
but coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how much is religious, how much is religion just being used as a political tool or as a geopolitical tool? That's where my questions are.
Hmm. Right. Well, I mean, from what I know of Benjamin Netanyahu, his grandfather was both a rabbi and a Zionist activist in the Russian Empire at that time. So although Netanyahu is a religious man, but he comes from a family in which there was those feelings, those views were strongly held. We still can see online conversations between Netanyahu and the late Menachem Mendel, is it? Some of whose members think that Rabbi Schneerson himself was the Messiah, even though he's now dead, of course. But the conversation between him and Schneerson was a very influential, very significant leader of a very significant section of the Jewish population, the Chabad Lubavitch sect. And may have seen this yourself. Well, you really need to get on and make sure the Messiah comes, and it's up to you to make sure he arrives. Yeah? And you haven't done enough yet, so as it were, get on with it. And the younger, the much younger Netanyahu at that time is saying, well, basically, yes, yes, Rabbi, yes, we're doing what we can, so to speak. Yeah. But you can imagine that even if he were just to achieve the so-called Greater Israel on the map, so to speak, which would be a significant expansion of Israel's borders, well, then from the Israeli point of view, he would go down in history as a great Jew, a great Israeli. Yeah? So even if he's not particularly religious, he would have that perhaps personal motive. But there is the question of the goals of the people in Britain and America who wished to support Zionism over 100 years ago during the First World War. And of course, in that context, we come back to the motivations of Arthur Balfour, the British politician who signed the Balfour Declaration in November 1917. Which promised the Palestine as a homeland, a national homeland for the Jewish people, whilst at the same time supposedly not prejudicing the interests of the people, the majority Arabs who were already there. And what was that about? Well, we know from historical documents that while Balfour had sympathy, certainly, for the Zionist cause, a sympathy which had only really grown, I would say, over the previous, what shall we say, 5 to 10 years at the most, before the Balfour Declaration was signed. He was particularly influenced by conversations he had with Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionists in Britain. who was also a scientist at the Manchester University. And the conversations which Balfour had with Weizmann played, I think, a significant part in encouraging, or in Balfour feeling more and more open and sympathetic toward the Zionist cause. But we know from various documents between members of the British elite during the First World War that the main reason why Balfour did what he did was because he felt that it was really necessary that the sympathies of wealthy Jews in America, particularly, be secured for the Allies, for Britain and France, in their struggle against Germany in the First World War. That was really in other words, it was a tactical decision within the context of the war, because the war was not going well for the British and the French in 1916, 1917. And it was in that crucial period, 1916-17, that this push was made, which resulted eventually in the Balfour Declaration. And although America came into the war in April 1917, and the Balfour Declaration was given in November 1917, it was still felt that, and by the way, it was just a few days before the Bolshevik 1917. It's called the October, the Russian calendar and the Western calendar. But in Western terms, the revolution took place in November 1917. And the Balfour Declaration was given in November the 2nd. So although America was already in the war by that point, it was felt absolutely necessary by the British that America should stay strongly on board, because it was felt that by that time, only with American support is the war going to be won, by the support, American troops. Only then will the war with Germany be won. So that was clearly one major factor. Another major tactical factor was, it was felt that that the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, would be terminated, which was Britain was fighting against, as the Turks were allies of Germany, that the Ottoman Empire would come to an end after the war, and then would come the question of, well, what would be the larger geostrategic picture? The French were wanting to get Syria. The old rivalries between Britain and France meant that the British didn't want the French to get control of Palestine or the Holy Land. Then there were Britain's interests in Egypt. Britain was controlling Egypt, and Britain had control of the Suez Canal, which was absolutely crucial for continued British control of not only of India, but also the whole route towards Australia and New Zealand, the whole of Asia, really, and Britain's interests in the whole of the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean region. So the British wanted to make sure that they could keep control of Egypt. Now, during the First World War, Egyptian nationalism was strongly growing, and there were concerns within the British elite that after the war, it might well happen that Britain would lose control of Egypt to the Egyptian nationalists. Well, if that were the case, how then could Britain maintain its control of the Suez Canal? Well, if you had a Jewish state in Palestine, which was well disposed towards England, Britain, and even grateful to Britain for making it possible for the Jews to have Palestine as their national homeland, then the obligation that would be felt towards the British on the part of the Jews would mean that you had a modern European, Western educated population in Palestine, which could serve Britain's interests as guardian of that region, and also of the Suez Canal, as it were, to make sure that if Egypt, for example, started using the Suez Canal wrongly, that pressure could be applied from a pro-British Israeli or Israel or Palestine. So there was that motivation as well. And that motivation was even given to the British government, or suggested to the British government, by a member of the British cabinet, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet in 1914, Herbert Samuel, Liberal government minister in the cabinet. He was in the cabinet when war was declared in August 1914. And in November 1914, when Britain and Turkey finally went to war with each other, Herbert Samuel went to the Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, and suggested to him, well, this would be a good moment for Britain to realize a Jewish state in Palestine. And that's where that notion there was first put in, or first entered into the discussions of the British cabinet. And then that went on through the war. And as things turned out, by 1917, it was realized, well, yes, actually, this would work very much to our advantage in terms of our strategic interests, in the imperial interests in the region.
Okay, so it's not just well, is it religious as well then?
Well, I think really, from the British point of view, there was not much religious about it, Mick. I mean, certainly it was the case that many British politicians at that time, such as David Lloyd George, the later Liberal Prime Minister from 1916. So he was Prime Minister when the Balfour Declaration was signed. And Balfour himself, as I said, was Foreign Secretary under Lloyd George when the declaration was signed, Balfour Declaration. These men were men who had grown up thoroughly familiar with the Bible and the Old Testament. The Lloyd George had said that he knew the kings of ancient Israel far better than he knew the kings of England, for example. And as a Welshman, he felt very sympathetic toward the struggle of the small Zionist Jewish population, surrounded by this large Arab population, and also the Turks, who were at that time, as it were, legally owning the land. So there were sympathies of an emotional nature on the part of some of these leading politicians in Britain, but the main interests, or the main motives, which pushed Britain into the Balfour Declaration, were certainly I would say, of an imperial nature, serving Britain's imperial interests in the long term, and then tactically, as I said earlier, to ensure that America stayed on side with Britain in the struggle against Germany. So you got a short-term struggle to win the war, and then you got a long-term perspective of how do the British continue their imperial interests in the region after the war and ongoing.
And is that like right up to today, and Iran, them going into Iran is just the next step of that, or?
Yeah, well, you see there again, I mean, everything. Well, once we start to open this whole thing out, it gets more and more complicated, doesn't it? For example, why did the 1979 revolution happen? Well, it happened because of the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran in the 1970s was already starting to get interested in possessing nuclear weapons himself. The Americans didn't want him to get nuclear weapons. The Pakistanis under Bhutto had just developed nuclear weapons. So you had Pakistan was developing nuclear weapons, India was developing nuclear weapons, and then the Shah of Iran comes along and says, well, he becomes interested in developing nuclear weapons. Pakistan is his neighbor, of course, and Israel was already a nuclear power, a secret nuclear power. So from the American point of view, they wanted non-proliferation. They didn't want more and more countries, particularly not Muslim countries, to gain nuclear weapons because of this, again, this strength, both of the Jewish lobby in America and of the Christian Zionist lobby in America, wanting to protect Israel. And those interests got very much stronger after the Six-Day War in 1967. The sympathies and the positivity in Western countries towards Israel. So the Americans didn't want Muslim countries really to be possessing nuclear weapons. So it's interesting, for example, that Bhutto was forced out. He was replaced by Zia, and then Zia is in Pakistan, and then Zia himself met with a very sticky end. And so then, of course, the Shah of Iran was ousted. And then the war begins in Afghanistan when the Americans helped to set up a struggle between the Muslim fundamentalists in Afghanistan and the Soviets as part of their anti-Soviet strategy. But if you ask, well, where did the Shah of Iran come from? Well, who put him there? Well, again, it was the Americans and the British who put him there, right? In the rather well-known by now coup, which Britain and America organized against the Prime Minister Mossadegh back in 1953, who had nationalized British oil interests in Iran. So from the
That's where
Iranian
BP
point of
comes
view,
from, isn't it? Sorry to cut you off. Is that where BP comes from?
no. BP's much goes back to Iran back before the First World War. In
Okay, yeah.
fact, I think I'm right in saying that the first chap to successfully prospect for oil in Iran was Australian. Um, uh, was it Darcy Thompson? I can't remember his name exactly, I'm afraid, but it's there's a good book about that. I'm just looking at there it is. This book here, Century of War by F. William Engdahl, which goes into this Anglo-American oil politics and the New World Order. So
Sorry, I cut you off.
that goes back to, it's okay, that goes back to 1905, that sort of period, yeah. And but that was originally in Iran, and then also oil was discovered in what is now northern Iraq, yeah. But this was part of Persia at that time. And this Australian persuaded the Shah to give him the rights to prospect and found the oil. And the British government, of course, immediately became extremely interested in it. And the whole question of the oil in southwestern Iran and what is now northern Iraq, the oil fields there, and then from the British point of view, how to get that oil to the Mediterranean from which it could be shipped to Britain, right? And already before First World War, they had their eyes on the port of Haifa, which is today in Israel, and we're imagining, well, if we can get hold of the oil through a British company, and the BP, I think, British Petroleum was set up in, I think, about 1911, and by the British government, basically. And then the oil would be piped right across the desert to the Mediterranean at Haifa, and then out to Britain. Yeah, and of course the great importance of that was that this was vital for the new Royal Navy. I say new because the Royal Navy at that time was coal-fired, and oil was seen as a much more efficient form of energy for the Royal Navy. It produced less smoke. It took much less time to coaling battleships took an awful long time. Yeah, it took a lot of men to do it, a lot of hard labor, and a lot of time to do it. And so the ship was in effect out of action for a while the coaling was going on, right? Well, that wasn't necessary with when you're replenishing with oil. So, and also the ships could go faster. So from many perspectives, the future of the Royal Navy was seen to be an oil-powered navy. And so without a navy, there was no British Empire. So, so you see, again, we're back in Iran here, yeah, where the oil is discovered. And it was necessary for the British, therefore, from an imperial point of view. I say necessary, I mean obviously necessary from the interests of the imperial class in Britain, to ensure that Britain had control of the destiny of Iran, so that Britain's navy could continue to get its oil. Otherwise, there'd be no empire. And so right from 1905 back there, where you already see the British starting to interfere with the Iranian constitution, and then a bit later on, 1907 and so, where the British and the Russians are beginning to talk about how to divide up Russia divide up Iran into spheres of influence between them. The British have been interfering ever since. And then from 53, they bring the Americans in to help them do what they themselves could no longer do, namely effect a successful coup d'etat. So the Americans with the CIA were brought in to help with that. Yeah. So ever since 1905, Britain and America have been interfering with the destiny of Iran, which brings us really to where we are now. And that's even separate from the question of the founding of the State of Israel.
So regime change has been going on for a while then.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Just before we sort of move on, and I don't mean move on to another topic because we've got plenty more to say, but could we just define Zionism? Because there's always going to be this thing of people equate Judaism or the Jews with Zionism and the Zionist cause. Could we just define that quickly, Terry?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's not difficult, Mick, to find online um, conversations, interviews, and what have you with Jews who are anti-Zionist. Now, whether those are Jews who are secular left-wing Jews who don't want anything to do with what they see as imperialism, Israeli imperialism, or Israeli secular colonialism, or whatever label they want to put on it. So left-wing, sort of modernist, if you will, left-wing modernist secular Jews who are against Zionism, right? Or even against the state of Israel for that reason. On the other hand, you will find many religious Jews and Orthodox Jews who are also opposed to the state of Israel. And they're basically opposed because they say, well, it was God that the Jews should be exiled 2,000 years ago, and the Jews will not ever be able to return to the land where they were, say, 3,000 years ago, until God brings that about. And it's absolutely not the place of humanity, or rather Jewish human beings, to bring that about on behalf of God, so to speak. That's for God to do. And so they see the Zionist effort to create this state of Israel on what has to be seen as modern European ethno-nationalist lines, like to create an ethno-nationalist nation state on the European model of the 19th century in the Middle East, right? Because that's basically what Theodor Herzl and the original Zionists wanted to do. They wanted to create an ethno-national state, essentially for Jews, jointly living together with the Arabs. A few very idealistic Zionists may have been wanting that, but basically, the longer time went on, the more and more Jews moved to the region, to Palestine, the more it moved in the direction of, well, this is going to be run by us, not the Arabs. Yeah. So, yeah, I think the situation was such that once they had arrived there, it was going to be a Zionist state for Jews only. And so that was a situation which had been brought about by human beings. And from the Orthodox Jewish point of view, that's simply not on, because you are presuming to go against the will of God. So Zionism in this situation, from this point of view, is a secular, non-religious, or even anti-religious perspective, ideology, political ideology. It's not a religious motive. It's a political ideology driven by the circumstances of late 19th century Europe.
Okay, so there are certain groups, but from what I can tell, that are sort of just using the religious aspect. So I think I saw something. I think it might have been Tucker Carlson was talking about this idea of that some in these circles are wanting to actually build the so-called third temple, and that there's something to do with the some insignia
Yeah,
that's on the Israeli Defense Forces uniform or something that suggests this as well. I don't know. Do you know anything about that?
yes. Well, yeah, it seems that there are. I mean, it's hard to know how many member of the IDF have these patches on their uniforms, but there are some of them with patches showing an image of the third temple, and there are others with showing images of the map of Greater Israel, which is a map going from the River Nile in Egypt right through the Sinai, and then right as far as the Euphrates River, which would go virtually to the top of or to the north of Syria and all the way over to Kuwait. And then across the desert, usually a straight line, a big chunk of north, all of Jordan, Kuwait, and a little bit of even a little tiny bit of Turkey right up there in the north. Yeah. So that map is also on these patches. So where's that coming from? Well, as far as one can see, um, you've got the very ultra-Orthodox religious Jews who, as I said, are anti-Zionist. They would be happy, those Jews, if there was no state of Israel at all, and Jews continue to live anywhere in the world as Jewish communities until somehow their God brought it about that it was possible somehow for Jews to return. But it's absolutely not right that Jewish human beings should create a political ideological movement to do that. Then you've got those conservative Jews who are not as orthodox as the ones I've just mentioned, and who would argue that, well, what has happened since the First World War and the Balfour Declaration and so on, or even earlier than that, what's happened since, for example, since the Rothschilds and others paid for or financed the settlements of Jews in the Holy Land in the 19th century. And since that time, then gradually what's happened and what's led up to the state of Israel in 1948, all of those kind of things happening on the ground are evidence or proof of God moving in history, so to speak. And that therefore these are showing that it is God's will that that the state of Israel be founded. So there you can see that a religious motive is brought together with a political motive, which results in the creation of the state of Israel, right? So those people are happy to support the very Orthodox Jews. And by saying very Orthodox Jews, I'm talking about the Jewish people, both in Israel and outside Israel, who, for example, wear the various pieces of headgear and costume that one normally notices with Orthodox Jews. Yeah, the hair, the hats, the long kaftan coats, and so on and so forth. That you will see some of these people who are in favor of the state of Israel, and then you'll see arguably a smaller number who are not in favor of the state of Israel. And then, of course, you will see the secular Jews, either the Reformed Jews, who remain religious, as it were, within Israel, who are very modernist and are not dressed in these traditional costumes, and who don't observe all of the religious rules and obediences that the traditional Jews observe. So there are those people. And then there are what you could call perhaps the very left-wing atheist secular Jews, who are also in favor of the state of Israel because they believe that it is good for Jews, whoever they are, to have a state of their own where they can feel safe. So you've got all of these various motivations within Israel itself, and they're often arguing with each other, particularly, for example, over the question of compulsory service in the IDF. The people who are opposed to the state of Israel absolutely refuse to be conscripted to the IDF. So it's a very, very complicated picture. Yeah. And then that doesn't even begin to deal with the Christian Zionist aspect of the issue, which brings in the whole question of the religious motivations of the American fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists.
Well, yes, without going into that, and without well, possibly we're going to complicate things even further, because I want to ask you about the sort of, I suppose, the more esoteric dimension of these things, and maybe connected in the time we're living in now with what's happening,
Yeah, yeah.
and why is this happening now, and how is it related to, this particular time in history. We had a
Okay.
conversation a few weeks ago a little bit about
Yeah,
that, and
yeah.
so yeah, but I think you've done a great job of giving us a very
Well,
good sort of overview of the
but,
points on
Mick, sorry,
this.
I'm aware that I didn't answer something that you just mentioned, which is the question of the third temple, right? That with the third temple, um, which will relate to this more esoteric aspect you've just raised in a moment, yeah. But the third temple, the conservative Jews who support the state of Israel, not so much the secular left-wing atheist Jews who probably couldn't care two hoots about the third temple, whether it was there or not, but the religious Jews who support the state of Israel. They would like to see the third temple rebuilt. So that's the temple which would be rebuilt in the place of the one destroyed by the Romans 2,000 years ago, right? And it would be rebuilt in the place where the first two temples were built, both of which were destroyed. One destroyed by the Babylonians, the first one, and then the second one destroyed by the Romans. But they're on the same place on the Temple Mount, which, as you know, is where the Muslim holy shrines of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are. And to build that third temple there, which the religious Jews feel is absolutely necessary for the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, the Mashiach, as they call him, to return, and for the world, as it were, to be renewed by the coming of the Mashiach, then the third temple has to be there. And for that to happen, then those two Muslim buildings have to be destroyed. And for those two Muslim buildings to be done away with, then, well, you can imagine what consequences that would have, right? But at the moment, many of the really fanatical religious Jews are seeing, well, this is now the opportunity to do all of these things. This is it. So they're getting themselves in a kind of end times mentality, you see, just like the Christian Zionists, and just like also the Shia Muslim, not so much the Sunni Muslims, but the Shia Muslims in Iran, because they believe that there is they believe that we're approaching the time where the so-called I don't speak Arabic, so I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but something like the Mashiach ad-Dajjal, which basically means the deceitful Messiah. The Mashiach ad-Dajjal. The Mashiach ad-Dajjal is going to appear, and this deceitful Messiah will be defeated by the return of the prophet Isa, which is Jesus, the Muslim understanding of Jesus, and together with the hidden 12th Imam. So in Shia Islam, there are these 12 imams, and the last of these imams will return, and together with Prophet Isa, they will defeat this deceitful um, uh, the deceitful Dajjal, the deceitful Messiah. It's not really right to call him Messiah, but because that's originally a Jewish term, and you can't really call him an Antichrist because it's a Christian term. But the point is, you see, they're seeing, the Muslims are seeing that a certain evil spiritual being is going to appear and will be defeated by these two beings who were originally human beings, but are really, in a certain sense, not quite human beings. They're sort of between human beings and spiritual beings. The Prophet Isa and um, the Prophet Isa and uh, hmm, getting ahead of myself. The Prophet
The
Isa,
secret and
the 12th Imam. Thank you.
yeah.
The 12th Imam. Yeah. Whereas the Jews are waiting for their Messiah to come, who they believe is a human being and will become a king, a great king of the Jewish people, and will reorder the world, so to speak, as a human uh, political political leader. Yeah. So all of these three, these, and then the Christians in America, the Christian fundamentalists in America, are expecting that when this happens, when the third temple is rebuilt, and that will be a sign, and that the more and more Jews will return to the Holy Land, and then these Jews, most of them will become Christian, or at least a large number of them will become Christian, and that this will be a sign that the Christian Messiah is going to return. And before that, there will be a great struggle in the region, a great war in the region. And before the war, most of the Christian population will be raptured up into heaven, is some mysterious process, from where they will watch this great war going on down below. And then when the war is over, then the Christ will return again physically, and that's the Christian fundamentalist end times picture. So all three faiths, not the Sunni, not the Sunni Muslims, by the way, but the Shia Muslims of Iran, they are all expecting that these events are imminent. Yeah, these events are imminent. So that's why we're very, very focused on the particular specialness of this time we're living in now.
It's kind of strange that the Christian Zionists have got that going on as well. When in the New Testament, the way the second coming, so-called second coming, is addressed, it's addressed in a very specific way. It's quite clearly saying, well, for me, it's clearly saying that it's not going to be a person like in a human being in a physical body like Jesus was. It's something else. Yeah,
Yes,
Christ
yes.
himself says it's going to be more like lightning striking in the east and all that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not quoting that. I'm not quoting that. I'm paraphrasing, but
Hmm.
it's not an event that's linked with one human being appearing. So their reading of it, anyway, we all lots of different interpretations of the Gospels, of course, but it seems strange to me.
Yeah, well, indeed. And the Christian fundamentalist view that that's coming so strongly from America, from people like Pastor John Hagee of Christians United for Israel, for example, who has some 10 million followers, yeah, in the US. And I think altogether there are at least 40 million Christian fundamentalists uh, in America who broadly subscribe to this perspective of the rapture and of the imminent return of Christ and of the end times, right? And that begs the question, well, what is this phenomenon? Because obviously most Christians don't subscribe to this perspective, yeah? Whether they are Catholic or whether they are Anglican or Orthodox, Christians in Russia and Eastern Europe, they don't subscribe to that. They will see that the end of the world, as described by the Apocalypse of St. John, is far, far in the future. And an anthroposophical view, as given by Rudolf Steiner, would agree. We're not looking now in the 21st century from an anthroposophical view at the imminent return of Christ Jesus. And in any case, Steiner pointed out that Christ Jesus only comes once physically, and that the next time, well, rather not the next time, but in fact, he's already present in the etheric world. That's the invisible world of life forces around the planet Earth and around us as human beings, the life forces of our planet. And it's in that realm, which also happens to be the realm of the angelic realm, that the Christ is now living. And it's in that realm that the Christ was living before he incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth 2,000 years ago. So you've had a situation where a spiritual being, a mighty spiritual being, who St. John calls the Logos, the Word, incarnates over many eons of time, slowly incarnating, coming down to the human level, incarnates in Jesus of Nazareth, and then after the ascension is, as it were, excarnating, and is now again in the etheric world, not the physical world. So there will be no need, there'll be no reason again for Christ Jesus to come physically. And that's where we come to your earlier point about the esoteric aspect. Do you want to speak about that now?
Yeah, that'd be good. Just to say to that as well. Sometimes I think that can be misunderstood, that there's this kind of there is this excarnation happening, and a lot of people equate that with a kind of a, we're all, or if we're spiritually evolved, we're going to move into this fifth dimension kind of thing. And I always just sort of clarify that by saying, well, Christ, this the logos, the word as it was spoken in John's gospel, took on human form completely,
Mm,
took on a
mm,
physical body, fully entered into a physical human
yeah,
being in
yeah,
order
yeah,
to
yeah,
give the impulse for human beings to be able to begin to experience the spiritual world again and
yeah,
make that trajectory back in, but not having, having taken up matter, or rather transformed matter itself, not having just sort of, like, not some sort of old ancient Eastern idea where we're just, matter is bad, the earth is
yeah,
bad, we want to
yeah,
just get back to nirvana or whatever it is.
yeah,
But actually, we're going to transform matter. And so I think it's just always important because there's so much talk now about Christ consciousness and those
yeah,
sort of big cosmic pictures, not to forget that actually it's
yeah,
it's matter, it's the
yeah,
earth itself, it's the physical body that
yeah,
Christ took on. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. That is the essence of the incarnation. Yeah, um, and that really is related, isn't it, to the question of in the Western world, we lost most people in the Western world for the past 2,000 years nearly lost the consciousness of karma and reincarnation. So they lost the consciousness of the fact that the human being has more than one life. So therefore, this one, and there are profound reasons for that, and we could go into that maybe later, but it had the consequence that people in the Western world were so focused on this one life that they wanted to, it's what I would call, the Jim Morrison effect. We want the world and we want it now. We want to speed up everything. We want the revolution. We want the revolution now. We want the world to be perfected in my lifetime. This essence to accelerate things because I want to see heaven on earth in my lifetime. And I think it works very deeply in the subconscious of very many people in the West, and has done for a long, long time. Yeah? And then because many of these people um, have reincarnated from former incarnations in, for example, Asian countries, that where the connection with the earth was somewhat weaker, so to speak, yeah, or where they may have been, for example, in a Buddhistic situation, so not so interested in being in, as you were saying now, to transform the earth, but rather to get off the earth as soon as possible. And I think one can sense that there is something of that in these feelings of the Christian fundamentalists, particularly in America, that really they would like to exit the earth and be with Christ in some sort of um, uh, blissful existence. And what is spoken of in the rapture, for example, yeah? There's not so much interest in transforming the matter of the earth for many of these people, and also for many of the people in the New Age movement. There's not so much interest in that, but rather there is interest in experiencing cosmic bliss in some non-material form, and not really wanting to go through the process of many lives and transforming matter. Yeah? You even find it strangely, people saying things like, well, I can't be doing with, lots of lives. I would just like to have one or possibly two at the most lives where I can just experience this cosmic bliss and experience oneness with whatever it is, the divine Sophia or the cosmic consciousness, and forget about the earth. Yeah? And that is not, I completely agree with you, that is not a Christian perspective, as I understand esoteric Christianity, certainly not in the picture that Rudolf Steiner brought. Yeah? But it has very much to do with this whole enormously long process of the incarnation, we could say, of the earth itself, out of spirit, out of cosmic spirit, down to this condensed state, this condensed mineral physical earth in which we're living now. And then after the time of Christ, the very, very slow and gradual excarnation. But this excarnation is a process which thoroughly involves humanity, and which humanity has to go through and transform the physicality of the earth, which of course includes transforming our own physicality as well. And the turning point in all of that process came in the what Rudolf Steiner calls the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, or what you could call in historical terms, or at least in Western historical terms, the Greco-Latin epoch, right? From the 8th century before Christ until the 15th century after Christ. So if you look at that whole period, then you see that the center point of that whole period, which is 2,160 years. Why 2,160 years? Because it's based on the whole process of the precession of the equinoxes, that you have these as in the relationship of the sun, the earth, and the zodiac. Then we have these periods of 2,160 years where the sun, as seen from the earth, moves against the background of the zodiac 1 degree every 72 years, right? So 30 degrees in one constellation or star sign gives you 30 times 72 is 2,160 years. So from this perspective, we are now in what Steiner called the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, or what astrologers would call the age of Pisces. And we're going to be in this age of Pisces for quite some time yet, and we could get into that later, because that's another whole other question, particularly with the New Ages. but the point I want to get to is that it's this central period, the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, the age of Aries, before the age of Pisces. That's the age of Aries, is the age of the Greco-Latin period from the 8th century BC to the 15th century AD. And right in the middle of that period is the year 333 AD, so the 4th century. And Rudolf Steiner emphasizes many, many times, particularly from about 1918 onwards, the incredible importance of this 4th century AD. So this is happening literally 333 years after the birth of Jesus. But he's saying that really the spiritual events, the esoteric event which took place then, we cannot limit only to 1 year, but that particular year just happens to be in the center of this 2,160 years of the fourth epoch, right? And the esoteric event which he's speaking about, which is so important at that time, has a great deal to do with human freedom. And this relates back to the whole question of Jews and Muslims and Christians, because if you imagine this picture of the condensation which I mentioned out of spirit into the physical mineral world, and the Christ being the Logos, as it were, accompanying the descent of human beings to that point, and then accompanying the human beings on the excarnation, the outbreathing, back to spirit. Very, very long process. And this center point, 333, the 333 years, is the middle of the fourth epoch, and the fourth epoch is the middle of the post, the whole larger post 7 periods, the 7 epochs of the post-Atlantean evolution. So that's about 15,000 years altogether. And the fourth epoch is the center of it. And we are now in the fifth epoch. So the fourth epoch is the center of that. And it's in that fourth epoch that the Christ, the Logos, the Christ appears. And something happened in the spiritual world, Steiner points out, in that fourth epoch, which is absolutely key to understand. Because what Christ did is, well, he did many things, but one of the important things that he did was that he brought the impulse of freedom and truth to humanity at that time. And what does that mean? Steiner points out that in the fourth century after Christ, something happened amongst the hierarchies of the spiritual world, the spiritual hierarchies, of which there are 9 levels of consciousness. And we are the 10th level, the lowest level, human beings, and we are spiritual beings operating in this mineral physical level. And then above us are 3 hierarchies, so 3 levels of consciousness: angels, archangels, and archai. And those are the 3 hierarchies who are the closest to human beings. Each one of them is, again, vastly more conscious than the one below it. So those are the 3, however, who are closest to us. So angels are related to us personally, individually. Archangels are related to us as collectives, as groups, as peoples and nations and other human collectives. And archai are related to the whole human race, to humanity. And then above them, until the time of Christ, and really we could say until the fourth epoch, more broadly speaking, until that time were the beings who in the Old Testament are called Elohim. And still in Hebrew, it's a Hebrew term, Elohim, and in Greek, they're called the exousiai. And the exousiai, the word means powers or authorities. St. Paul uses this term in the New Testament. And these exousiae are, as it were, the lowest of the next three ranks of the hierarchies. Remember, altogether there are 9 spiritual hierarchies, and we are the lowest. We are the 10th hierarchy because we are operating on the physical plane. But there are 9 spiritual hierarchies above us. And Steiner points out that in the 4th century AD, what he calls the cosmic intelligence, which was administered, is the term he uses, that the exousiae, the powers or authorities, were the beings who were responsible for the intelligence of the solar system. Let's just restrict ourselves to the solar system for the moment, yeah? So the sun and the planets and the zodiac world, without going to all of the various galaxies, but just restricting ourselves to that for the moment, that those beings were responsible for the intelligence. But that means the intelligence which is incorporated in nature, and the intelligence which is incorporated in humanity, in human being, human thought. And so those beings are of such because human thought was connected with natural thought or natural intelligence, that gave a kind of compulsive nature to human thought in the time before the 4th epoch, which meant that in ancient times, human beings, when they were thinking or looking at the natural world, the thoughts that were connected to the objects of the natural world arose in their minds spontaneously, objectively, if you will. There was no sense in which I am in control of my thoughts, but rather that the thoughts come to me from the world, from the objects. Yeah. And it's only really from the fourth century AD that human beings begin to have their own thoughts and to feel, well, I am thinking. It's not the world is thinking through me, but rather I am thinking. I am responsible for my thoughts. I am creating my thoughts. Yeah? And that's partly because that most human beings who are not yet connected with the Christ impulse consciously, they were still in this mode of being where they were identifying themselves with this descent of man, so to speak, and they were still in this mode of thinking that I am not that they were not consciously thinking I am responsible for my thoughts, but they were feeling that because the responsibility for the cosmic thoughts had been handed over, or rather handed down, from the exousiae down to the archai. So from beings of the 2nd hierarchy, so that's the middle of the 9 hierarchies, the group of 3, the lowest of the group of the 2nd hierarchy, down to the highest of the 3rd hierarchy. And the 3rd hierarchy are closest to humanity. So now the responsibility for the intelligence of the solar system, and including the intelligence of man, comes a very big step closer to humanity. It's now in responsibility of the hierarchy which is closest to humanity, the archai, who are also called the principalities by St. Paul in the New Testament. And Steiner gives them his own names. He gave his own names to some of these hierarchies, and he calls them the spirits of personality. And that name is a kind of a clue in a way, because it points to the fact that the intelligence which human beings have now becomes more of something which is closer to us personally and individually, whereas when the intelligence was the responsibility of the exousiae or the Elohim, then it had this compulsive behavior. It was as if the intelligence was really part of the natural world, and there was no sense whatsoever in which human beings felt, I am in charge of that. So that meant that when human beings were trying to connect with their gods, with their spiritual world, that they could not do that consciously in the pre-Christian in the pre-Christian world. They could not do it they could not do it consciously. They had to rely on rituals and initiation processes, which often put them into an unconscious condition where they were taken through an initiation process. Sometimes that involved the use of natural substances, for example, various forms of drugs or whatever you have. And they were taken through a process where they were unconsciously able to become united with the creative forces of the universe, because the exousiae and the Elohim, which Steiner gave the name the spirits of form, these beings are creative beings. The angels, archangels, and archai are not creative beings, because their task in the spiritual universe is to be related to humanity, and it's not humanity's role yet to be fully creative beings. Certainly not creative in relation to in relation to nature. That comes later. The nature that surrounds us was created by the gods, not by us, of course. Yeah. But so what we're seeing in the 4th century is an incredibly important moment in spiritual evolution, where the whole notion of responsibility for human thought ceases to be something in which humanity obeys the thought of the gods, obeys the commandments of the gods, because, as it were, humanity can do no other, because there is something compulsive about it. But now this is given over. The responsibility for human thought is given over to human beings through the archai. And therefore, the whole issue of human freedom since the time of Christ, because of course all of these hierarchies are, as it were, under the leadership of the Logos. Yeah, they're all they are all, the Logos is the center of all of these 9 hierarchies. So since the time of Christ in Jesus, then we see how there's a human being in those 3 years, in his relationship, for example, as we can read in the New Testament, how he relates to the disciples, how he treats them. I don't speak to you as servants. You're no longer servants. I speak to you as friends. Yeah. This is not the idea that one is a servant of God or a slave of God, but rather a friend of God, a friend of the divine. And this is the huge transformation which takes place, such that, for example, in spiritual terms, one is no longer subject to a sacred text. One no longer obeys the commandments of a sacred text, or is expected to do so, as we find both in Judaism and in Islam, the holy book of the Quran, or as we find in traditional Christian fundamentalism. You have to obey the commandments laid out in the 10 Commandments and others. Yeah. Strict Protestants would have also attempted to follow many of the commandments in the Old Testament too. So what happened there in the 4th century is of tremendous importance from a spiritual perspective in relation to the question of freedom and unfreedom. So I would just make one final point about it, and that is that to perhaps make it a bit clearer, is that in his first book, The Philosophy of Freedom, or The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, where Steiner describes the relationship in human thinking between perception, sense perception, and concepts, the thoughts which we bring to explain our sense perceptions and make sense of them. So you have sense perceptions coming from the outside and concepts coming from thinking from the inside, so to speak. And then we are able to make sense of the world through bringing these 2 things together. In ancient times before Christ, those 2 things belonged together and were given to us. We didn't have to do anything, so to speak. We didn't have to create them, because they were under, as it were, the control of the exousiae, the Elohim. But since the time of Christ, and particularly since the 4th century, the there's been this separation in the spiritual hierarchies such that the exousiae and the Elohim are still in charge of the sense perceptions, but no longer in charge of the concepts, no longer in charge of the intelligence, the human intelligence, which can make sense of the sense perceptions. Yeah. So now trying to bring these two things together, the concepts and the sense perceptions, is something which is up to us. And that's only been possible because of this separation of these capacities between the exousiae and the archai, who are much closer to us, and therefore we are now able to do that. Sorry, that's been very long, but I hope
That's
that
good.
makes it clear.
No, that's really good, Terry. And then I suppose that's a reason why it's much easier for us now to be misled by our own conceptions
Yeah,
of everything that we perceive
yeah.
around us, but including political things or whatever it is that we're perceiving. Um,
Yeah, not only political things, but also, in fact, religious things, Mick, because this is the reason why, with this new capacity for us thinking for ourselves, why, for example, in the early Christian centuries, well, up to the time of the Crusades, really, there was so much dispute amongst the different Christian groups about their understanding of the concepts of religion, you see. What is the relation of Father and Son, or the Holy Trinity, or the Holy Spirit and the Son? Does the Holy Spirit come from the Son or from the Father? And all of these issues, which then later became the subject of dogma.
that's right. Yes. So you have all the church councils where it becomes necessary to come together, make decisions about doctrine,
Yeah,
and you know, uh, cast some people with certain views outside of the church and say, you're in this group's inside the church because you believe
yeah,
this, the
yeah,
dogma, and you have to be outside the church.
yeah.
Yeah, good, great point. And so, Terry, going on from there, so the year you mentioned the fourth century.
Mm,
Could you lead us on from there? So, what? Obviously, we're not in that same position. That radical change has taken place, and this baton, in a sense, has been passed down from the exousiae to the archai, closer and
yeah,
closer to the human being, the cosmic
yeah,
intelligence. What
yeah,
what does that mean for where we are now? I mean, you have to walk through a bit further
yeah,
through time.
yeah. Well, where we are now, I mean, I think in the West, Mick, that means that people in the West either they fall into this really unfortunate error, I would think, which people in the West began to fall into in the 17th century, and particularly in the 18th century, which is that all Western people before us were children and superstitious fools. So they basically would dismiss the Middle Ages and all the ancient cultures, unscientific, superstitious nonsense. So all of their spiritual views and the way they saw the world and all of that, we, uh, the modern people, since 17th century, since Galileo, Newton, uh, and all the great scientists of that time, since Voltaire, since Darwin, and so on and so forth. Yeah, the intellectuals of the modern Western world, the atheist intellectuals who would dismiss all of this religious, spiritual, um, uh, these spiritual interests as so much childish superstition. That's one way in which these people would understand the situation which the West finds itself in today. If you remember some 20, 25 years ago online, you could see the four, what they used to call themselves, I think the four atheist horsemen of the apocalypse, or the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, right? Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and who was the
Richard
fourth one? Oh,
Dawkins.
Richard
Dawkins.
Dawkins. Thank
Yeah.
you, of course. How could I forget Richard Dawkins? Yeah, that these four guys uh, were giving lots of presentations together in public and online. And you could see that they really felt that they were trying to, as it were, finish off the religious, what was left of, as they saw it, religious consciousness. They were particularly bothered by the rise of, as they saw it, of Islam in the 90s, and the whole thing with the political aspects of the struggle against Islam as they understood it, yeah, and the threat which they saw from Islam to modern science, completely forgetting that much of modern science came from the Muslim world, or if they were not forgetting that, they were forgetting the religious aspect of all of that, you know. But I mean, basically, what I'm getting at here is that the intellectuals of the Western world, who, after the 17th century, after the wars of religion in Europe, wanted to dismiss religion and just go down a purely secular atheistic route, and regarded anybody who didn't want to go down that route as unmodern and foolish and superstitious. Yeah, that's one way in which the West can continue to go. And I think that will just continue to lead us to disaster. And largely, in many ways, out of that came the two world wars, I would argue. Fascism, communism, imperialism, materialism, all the other isms. But the other way is that that the West needs to go is really to understand how all these processes of the religions, that is pagan polytheism and the monotheisms of Islam and Judaism, and how they relate to Christianity and to the religions of the such as, for example, Buddhism, which again is in a sort of section by itself in a way, because it doesn't really, particularly not with Gautama Buddha, it's not really interested in gods and goddesses, unlike Hinduism. But how all of these different spiritual paths relate, and of course that is a major concern of anthroposophy. Until Western humanity can relate all of those things together, then we're only going to get further strife and warfare between not only the peoples of East and West, that means the secular atheist cultures of the West and the more religiously inclined cultures of the East, but we're also going to have civil wars, so to speak, like, for example, within America, between what you have as the woke people, let's say, of California, the Gavin Newsom kind of politicians on the one hand, and then the politicians of the Bible Belt in the US, Republican Christian Zionists on the other side. Unless one can find a way to relate to show how all of these actually are related. And I think that, of course, is one of the fundamental tasks of anthroposophy, to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, can I just add to that, Terry? 'Cause I think that's really, really important. And this relating together of these different streams and different religious traditions and the religions themselves. It's not about sort of mashing them all together and
No,
just thinking, well, yeah, they've got this common ground and do unto others, and they've got this and that and the other thing in common,
yeah,
but actually to really discern the differences as well,
yeah,
to see where they fit into this, if you like, spiritual evolution that's taking place. And that's what I think is very difficult for more fundamentalist, dogmatic religious people to understand, or they actually won't come at it because they don't believe that there is any spiritual evolution taking place. It's like it's all fixed
yes,
and
yes,
it's all set and there's no more revelation.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so this relating together, I totally agree with you, but it can't be just a sort of a mash up new age. Oh yeah, just take a little bit from this and a little bit from there.
mm,
Anthroposophy is sort of, in my view, the only worldview I've seen that's been able to sort of show where all these different ways of thinking fit into the big picture.
yeah. I
You know,
mean, I think we could see. I mean, and Steiner also discussed this from various perspectives. You can see how, for example, in the 19th century, when materialism was really becoming very, very strong in the first half of the 19th century, that there was an effort on the part of the spiritual powers behind, so to speak, behind the ongoing historical processes, from this working from the spiritual world, to bring a new spiritual impulse which could counter this materialism, yeah, and lead humanity in a healthier direction. But unfortunately, that effort became rather it headed off in unfortunate directions. One was spiritualism, where people ended up doing physical things like wrapping tables and moving glasses around on the tables and what have you, and basically largely communicating with the spirits of the dead, and focusing on the dead instead of focusing on what I think the original intention there was, which was to try to open people's minds to the etheric forces which were surrounding the human being in the forces of nature, for example, yeah? Not just the world of the dead, but the forces of nature itself. So that headed off in that wrong direction. And the other was theosophy. And theosophy was definitely an effort to do something which is very necessary still today, and that is to show respect for the traditional ancient spiritual paths and religions of Asia and other cultures, yeah. Not to have this attitude of 19th century intellectuals that, well, that's all childish superstition. We are much better than that. We've moved on from all of that nonsense. Yeah? But rather really to try to understand that, and further, more so, to see what is of value in that and what can be carried on in the future. Unfortunately, because of what happened in the 4th century, and this is why the 4th century is again so important, and what I was saying earlier, that because of what led to all of those problems of conceptualizing and understanding the Christ event, which led the Christian church, down the wrong paths in many respects, particularly after the church was, as it were, fused with the Roman Empire under Constantine and thereafter, yeah, and in other words, fused with structures of power and authority, and hierarchy, which had been continued from ancient Rome, which again is nothing to do with freedom and working things out for yourself, but following dogmatically the commandments which are laid down by the spiritual authorities for you. The human exousiae, if you will, yeah. Because of that continues right through into the Christian world, carries on in the Orthodox Church, carries on in the Roman Catholic Church, carries on even in the Anglican Church, and carries on even in the sectarian Protestant sects, to the point where we get the Salem witch trials in North America and so on and so forth, yeah. This idea that anybody who steps out of line will be condemned, that you must follow the spiritual authorities. Yeah? This is all to do with that we haven't really, from the 4th century right, and even until the 19th, yeah, we hadn't really fully understood what had happened in the 4th century, which means we hadn't really understood what Christ himself had brought when he came incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth, trying to encourage human beings to take responsibility for their own thinking, yeah, instead of wishing to continue to belong to race, to nation, to family, to tribe, to clan, which means the compulsive effect of what works naturally and subconsciously in the human being, but rather to understand with your own spirit, your own individual spirit, to find your spiritual path forward. So the theosophists, because many people have not been able to do that, particularly let's say in the Middle Ages, that meant, Mick, that many people who were nominally Christians, part of the broad Western Christian church, or Christendom as it was called, suffered. All the heretics, for example, all those heretics suffered terribly from many things that the church did. Obviously, things like the Inquisition come to mind, yeah. But not only that. I mean, there were the horrible persecutions of Christians in the early days of Christianity, when it was a state church in the late Roman Empire, which is often forgotten about. Yeah, that was a terrible process. How the Christians who recently had been persecuted themselves now started persecuting the pagans, you see, and had the power of the Roman Empire behind them to do that. And the temples were all destroyed, and the artworks were destroyed, and so on and so forth, right? So because that was felt keenly and deeply by all those people who suffered, and then they died and carried all that into the spiritual world, and then they're reborn in subsequent centuries, and they have these anti-Christian attitudes. Or people from other parts of the world, whether they would be North American Indians or Africans or people from Asia, who also had negative experiences of the Christian church, behaving in arrogant or persecuting ways towards them. So you have a lot of people reborn in, for example, the 19th and 20th century as Westerners in the so-called Christian world, who deep in their souls have a strong antipathy toward Christianity and to the Christian religion. But because they don't have the thought of karma and reincarnation, they're not able to really get to grips with, well, where does this come from in me as an individual? Yeah. But rather they just see, well, that has to do with Christianity itself as being a dogmatic, outmoded, old-fashioned system. And then the New Agers will say, well, we're now in the age of Aquarius, and that's all finished now. That belongs to the age of Pisces. So we've got to move on from the avatar Jesus Christ, and now we look for the new avatar of the age of Aquarius. Yeah? So from various perspectives, you have modern people in the West, secular people or New Agers, spiritually minded New Agers, or other people who are not particularly interested in spirituality, but they wish to reject. Christianity just doesn't occur to them anymore. They just, yeah, particularly anything that is to do with the traditional churches in any way whatsoever. There's a kind of more or less quite strong antipathy towards it. And that's very unfortunate, that because it prevents, I think, many people from understanding the whole historical pattern which we've gone through over the last 10,000 years or so.
Yeah, actually, my wife's studying at the moment, and when she's writing a historical, I hope she doesn't mind me saying, writing a historical fiction novel, and when she's talking to young people in her class about what's happening in the novel, they go, "Oh, it's very religious, isn't it? It's a very religious, lot of religion there." Well, she's writing about a time in history when that was normal, you know.
Yes.
But there is actually something happening as well. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, Terry, but there is a little bit of I think it's a lot to do with this encounter with evil, which is really occurring, especially coming into the mainstream news at the moment about the Epstein files and what the elite and the people who run the world are really up to. Um, and especially, I think if you look back at what happened during COVID as well, a lot of people sort of, in a sense, woke up to the fact, oh, maybe the news isn't telling us the truth. Maybe our politicians are not really saying what's really going on, et cetera, et cetera. And this sort of waking up to some degree to that is occurring. And some people are really finding that actually Christianity is the only thing that really can meet it. So a lot of new people who've been in the new so-called New Age, I know that that's a very broad term, but are sort of looking for something, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, they're heading towards the more dogmatic ways of practicing religion or spirituality. So it's almost like they've gone in the free, they've been hanging around in the smorgasbord of, I can pick and choose little bits and pieces, but then this encounter with what's been going on the last 10 years or so is woken them up to say, actually, I need something stronger that's
Yeah.
going to help me meet this, or at
Yeah.
least deal with the fact this is the case.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are going, a lot of young men, especially in America, are going toward the Orthodox Church, in
Yeah.
large part because of some of the YouTube, really good YouTube people, or really, philosophically astute YouTube
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And either that or going into some very strong sola scriptura Protestant movement, which is like the word of the Bible is it. That is
Yeah.
the word, and this misconception about the word of God being what's literally written in the book.
Yeah.
Missing out on things like the word concept fallacy, and not really being able to explore things more deeply.
Yeah.
Um, Sorry, I'm sort of rambling a bit there, but there's just a couple of points I wanted to mention briefly,
Mm.
that you'd hit on, and we don't have to dive into them, but just wanted to flag them. But you talked about the so-called new atheists that popped up,
Mm.
the
Mm.
four horsemen, as it were.
Mm.
I always had this sense that they were kind of like, who was funding these guys? Who was putting them on? Who was pushing them out the front so strongly? It was really like a cultural. It felt to me like um, a sort of planned out cultural thing to do. Let's convince as many people as possible. But the more I dug into that and really listened to their debates, they didn't stand up very well. Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. It's
Yeah.
very philosophically, it's pretty lame.
Mm.
It doesn't really, the materialist worldview doesn't really stand up to logical scrutiny in lots of ways, and he didn't do a good job of defending it. Um, so I wonder about that more as being more of a political push than really just scientists going, oh, let's try and get rid of Christianity. So I always wonder where that came from. Um, I just want to say a couple of other things. There was when you mentioned the spiritualism and this wanting to just focusing on the dead and connecting with the dead. I think it's also that was coming from a particular angle, and it was very much the mediumistic way of connecting with the dead. Not to
Yeah.
say that having a relationship with those that have died and our loved ones is necessarily a bad thing. We can actually, and with Steiner's work, a lot of work I've been doing with people is in that vein, that we can actually develop a healthy relationship with loved ones that have died, and it can actually be a spiritual path in a sense. But there is, the spiritualistic way of doing it, getting the glass to move on the table, which
Yeah. Yeah.
actually I got talked into doing when I was a teenager. So I've been
Yeah. Yeah.
in
Yeah.
there. I just wanted to, sorry, just a couple of things we skipped over that I just wanted to mention. I think that was it really. Um,
Mm.
oh, and one other thing was that with I noticed in the Epstein files, and we haven't really got time to go deeply into that, but there is this connection with some of the new age gurus and some of the more spiritual side of things that Epstein was talking about was to do with a lot of more Eastern practices. So one person who's mentioned in there and who said some not great things was Deepak Chopra, for example,
Mm.
and he's in there and he's connected with Epstein, and not just that connection, just because he knew him doesn't mean he's a bad guy or whatever. But some of the things he said seem pretty dodgy. So it's just interesting that there's a whole esoteric, spiritual thing going on with all of that as well.
Mm.
But
Mm.
yeah, I've probably thrown too many different points in there.
Yeah.
I don't know
I mean,
where we were now.
um, well, I mean, you uh, picked up there three things, yeah, and you mentioned the four horsemen. Um, I think even if, I mean, I can't say because I don't know, um, Mick, whether those four men were in any way brought together to serve a particular aim deliberately and consciously by some other group or whatever, or whether they were financed in any way to do that, or whether they were simply four individuals who came together and recognized that they had similar points of view and that they all felt for their own personal reasons that they had to oppose what they saw as a recrudescence of religiosity because of this perceived struggle between Christianity and Islam, which was occurring at the end of the 90s, yeah, or in the 1990s, with which sort of culminates in a certain sense with 9/11 and everything that was around that, yeah. But I would say that even if they weren't, let's assume for example, that they weren't deliberately brought together, there was no money moving or anything, I still feel that something like that phenomenon would have happened, because I felt at that time, around the year 2000, that was a particularly powerful point from the point of view of the forces of opposition to what I would call a healthy spirituality. And of course, one of the things that comes up there is something that you and I've discussed before, which is the whole question of the third iteration of the year 666, which was 1998, right? So you have the year 666 itself, then you have the year 666 years later, 1332, and then you have the year 1998. And in each of those periods, and Steiner pointed to those years, but I would say that from my own feelings and research, that it's not just one year, it's not just those years. And in the same way, Steiner himself says, when you look at the 4th century, it's not only the year 333 in the 4th century, right? But it's the 4th century as a whole, so to speak. But in a certain sense, Mick, it's even the larger period of the 4th epoch as a whole, because the 4th is the center of the whole thing. It's like in the process of sevenfoldness, like in the octave, where you've got the 7 tones in music, the 7 intervals, I should say, that the 4th interval, the interval of the 4th, is the middle point. Yeah, the midpoint in the, you have the do, re, mi, and then fa, sol, la, ti, yeah. It's that 4th which is the axial point there where things turn around, and of course it was in that point that the Christ incarnated in Jesus. So yeah, with the 4 horsemen, I think that it's somehow related, that they were a contemporary reflection of something related to this impulse of 666, which means this anti-Christic impulse, which comes with particular vehemence, particular strength, every time 666 years approximately reappears in history. And Steiner points out that this spiritual being called Sorath makes an intervention in history, not in an incarnated form as a human being, but as a spiritual being working through the minds of incarnated human beings, influencing the thoughts and minds and actions thereof of incarnated human beings. And that, as far as I can make out, and I've written about this, that in each of those 3 periods, so around 666, around 1332, around 1998, it was a window of about 25 years. So you're looking at a window around 666 of the years 641 to 691, with 666 in the middle. In 1332, you're looking at 1332 as the center point of a window which goes from 1307 to 1357. And in our modern time, you're looking at 1998 with a window of 1973 to 2023. So that window is just closed. Yeah. And so one has to look at what is the nature of events in those windows. And I think in those particular windows, you see this tremendous attack in broadly three different ways upon the human being and upon the human individual. And of course, that first window came 300 years after what happened in the 4th century. So this very, very new impulse of human freedom in human thought is immediately attacked very strongly by what happens in the 7th century there, around 666. Yeah. Well, we can also see that that is a time when the impulse of Islam comes out, and very, very quickly, with tremendous acceleratory power, spreads both east and west. So that by the end of that century, well, it was in the year 711 that the Muslims invaded Spain. So it's almost there. So around about 700 by the end of that century, and then going the opposite direction towards India. They conquered the Persian Empire and then moved further east. So tremendous force, a tremendous expansion of Islam, which of course is a religion of the complete other transcendental nature of God. I'm aware of the Sufi tradition, the mystical tradition of Islam, but that comes a bit later. But to begin with, it was the Quran, and the Quran, and what is laid down in the commandments of the Quran by Allah revealed to Muhammad. Yeah? And this was what was carried by the Muslim armies, east and west. So that was the first action in that first period, and but within that, again, in what is today Iran, what was then the Persian Empire, there is this, I think we spoke about this before, this incredible academy that existed, the Academy of Gondishapur, right? Which was a kind of academic hothouse at the crossroads of Asia, where knowledge and wisdom from all different directions of Asia came together, from Greece, from Egypt, from Babylon, from India, from even from China. And it all sort of came together there in the Academy of Gondishapur, which is in southwest Iran, just in close to that area where Iran and Iraq were fighting in the 1980s, just on the Iranian side of the border. The ruins of the Academy of Gondishapur can still be seen there. And also many of the people in the Academy of Gondishapur were Christians. They were Christians, not Nestorians. Yeah? Many Syrian Christians as well. But it was in this place that a lot of the knowledge from Greece came and was translated from Syrian into Arabic after the Arabic conquests, and then spread again via the Muslim conquests to various parts of the world, and eventually made its way around to Spain, and then through from Spain to Paris, University of Paris, University of Oxford, and eventually in the 17th century, the scientific ideas that were going along with that came from the Middle East and helped to really start off the natural scientific revolution in Europe. But what I'm getting at in all of that is that something of this major attack, 666 years, came again at the late 1990s, yeah, and that's why I think you saw, for example, the two trilogies, the Matrix trilogy and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, were in effect warnings about this. That although those two movies were very different, those two trilogies were very different, that they were actually warning about the same thing. They were warning that a tremendous force of evil, which was unitary and which was seeking to completely dominate the free consciousness of human beings and destroy it, basically, and turn human beings into servile creatures, in two different ways. And so the four horsemen, what they were doing in standing up for what they saw as natural science, but of course, what we've seen since that time, now at the point of biogenetics, robotics, and AI, and the incredible development of the internet and everything else, yeah, we're now at the point where somebody like Yuval Noah Harari can speak at the World Economic Forum and say, or in other places, interviews he's given and so forth, which one can see on the internet. This Israeli medieval historian who specializes in military history, right? Interesting in itself, saying things like, well, human beings are now just hackable animals, and all of this soul and spirit and free will stuff, that's all over. So somebody coming from, as he would see it, as a purely natural scientific perspective, arrives at the point of view that our natural science now tells us there is no consciousness, there is no spirit and soul, and none of this exists. There's only the electrochemical and biochemical reactions going on in the brain. And of course, ultimately, these are all controllable. They're controllable. So quantifiable and controllable from the point of view of natural science. Yeah. So this, I think, is related to what was coming out of right there, that first academic, the Academy of Gondishapur, which Steiner pointed out represented the real problem for the future of humanity. That every time this 666 impulse comes, there is an attempt to accelerate development in humanity beyond or faster than humanity is really capable of dealing with. And in our time, that is very much the case with natural scientific development, which is obviously based ultimately on electrical and electronic technology since the end of the 18th century. And at the end of the 18th century, going on to the second point you raised, spiritualism, at the end of the 18th century, where, again, very quickly, if you think 1780, Galvani and his frog's legs experiments, 1800, Volta and his first batteries, 1840s, Morse and telegraphy, and then even 1816, Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, the idea that electricity can be used to bring the dead parts of a human being back to life, and creating a new entity, a new living, in inverted commas, entity through using electricity. Yeah? All of this developing remarkably quickly and going along with steam power, but it's particularly electromagnetism that I would draw attention to. And so by the 1840s, 1850s, this materialism was really taking off very powerfully in the Western world. And Steiner points to the 1840s as this time where, for example, in Central Europe, idealist philosophy is ultimately defeated by materialism. And so the idealism of the first half of the late 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, the Goethe-Schiller period of German culture, and many of the other great people, the Humboldt brothers and so on, Hegel and so on. Yeah? This retreats in the 18th century, and Marxism comes in the 1840s. Yeah? Marxism and socialism very strongly, and also in philosophy. Interestingly, also you have the origins of the Zionist ideal there, really, with Moses Hess, a Jew who was very closely connected with both Marx and with Engels, and his book Rome and Jerusalem. So he was a Marxist, paradoxically, who became converted, so to speak, to the Zionist idea that the Jews have to return to the Holy Land. Yeah? That's already in the 1840s. But at that time, then, spiritualism comes. And I do agree with you that there are, and this is what Rudolf Steiner was very keen on, there are healthy ways to attempt to communicate to loved ones who have crossed the threshold, whether it be to help loved ones across the threshold who may be suffering, for example, suicides, or maybe it's to learn something from people who have crossed the threshold. But in the 1840s, it took this rather a direction which soon became a rather sinister direction, a rather doom-laden direction of communicating with the dead, which I think is very much leads on to the 20th century tendencies in, first of all, in, well, I guess to a large extent stemming from phenomena like Dracula and vampires, and the notion that the threshold of the spiritual world, everything to do with that, is dark and sinister and doom laden, and is connected with the dead and the undead and so forth. Yeah, and then that continues on in Hollywood and is pushed very strongly as a feature of our modern Western culture. So yes, spiritual. We have to try to. And Steiner was very keen to try to reorient our attempts to relate to those who had passed over the threshold away from this rather morbid connection with this gothic horror aspect of the dead, yeah, and instead to relate to the dead as beings who exist in the etheric and astral worlds, just across the very thin threshold, so to speak. Yeah. And then you spoke about Epstein and his connection with Deepak Chopra. But I think this is a really big subject, and I don't want to go on too long about it, Mick. But maybe if I could just try and speak for maybe 5-10 minutes at the most, yeah.
Yeah, please
And
do. Yeah.
yeah, it has to do very much with I mean, I was born in 52, so I went through the 60s as a teenager and was very aware, particularly from the mid 60s onwards, where you saw the Beatles going to India and connecting with things which were coming from India, right? And introducing not only instruments, musical instruments from India, but also philosophies from India. And then, as you know, that really, again, spread very rapidly. And particularly through the use of drugs, whether they be artificial like LSD or traditional Asian things from Asia like the opiates, hashish, and so forth. And you could see how that really powered into the masses of Western culture in the 60s. But all of that, all of those things, those interests in Asia and Asiatic spiritual paths and so on, of which Deepak Chopra is a part, although in a little bit later generation, all this Asian interest in Asian spirituality in the West was already going on in Steiner's time and before Steiner's time, in the days of Blavatsky and around about 1890s, 1900, right? The difference was that at that time, it was mostly wealthier people who were indulging themselves in those various things, whether it was free love, whether it was drugs, whether it was new forms of vegetarianism. The Theosophists were the first people to cremate themselves after death and so forth. All forms of Indian religion and all of these different kinds of spiritual paths, again, under the influence of Theosophy, which, as I said earlier, was interested in exploring all these different non-Christian, non-Western spiritual paths, right? But that was all through well-read, educated people. They were the people in Europe who could focus on that. The difference in the 60s was that, that effort to connect with those things was kind of parked for a while in Western culture by the effect of the two world wars. The shock effects of the two world wars sort of, I think, restrained all those influences coming from non-European cultures for a while. And then after it burst out again in the 60s. And the difference was that in the 60s, it was on a mass basis. Now that everybody could experience through mass travel and so forth, and the fact that many more people in Western culture now had lots more money, whereas in 1900, poor people, working class people couldn't, make a little bit of money and then go to Afghanistan and get high or whatever they were doing. Yeah? That was not possible. But so it was a mass movement in the 60s. And this is what the Beatles really, and then other groups, of course, contributed to. But so what was that about then? It was about, from an anthroposophical viewpoint, you could say that you had the impact of natural science, which came very strongly from the 17th century until it was given a certain break in the two world wars. And European civilization, first of all, became horrified by what had been done in the name of natural science in the First World War with the gas and with the tanks and the machine guns and all of these things, the products of natural science. But the effect was amplified vastly in the Second World War, which has, of course, culminated in the bombs, in the atom bombs, right? And then comes the sort of psychic shock. What are we doing? Where is natural science taking us? And then very quickly we see in the 1950s, Zen Buddhism appears in America with the Beat Generation, right? That was in the 50s, affecting music, affecting fashion, affecting poetry in the cultural realm. This is followed then through what comes through black music very strongly in the 50s, beginnings of rock and roll, appealing to the white audience. And then in the 60s, as I said, it's Asia. So to begin with, it was Asia, mostly intellectuals and people in the high cultural realm in the 50s. But in the 60s, it's everybody, really. Everybody begins to connect with Asia. And that leads on to the New Age movement of the 80s and so forth, of which Deepak Chopra and people like Ken Wilber and others are all part. Yeah. So it's what does that represent? And I think what it represents is part of this. It's obviously had some good developments, just as Theosophy had some good developments in helping certain individuals to take steps moving away from full-on materialism and redirecting individuals' lives to finding a way to a healthier form of understanding their life in spirit, in more spiritual terms, and perhaps even leading them eventually to esoteric Christianity. I mean, before I discovered Steiner, I was investigating Gurdjieff, for example, and before that Tai Chi, and before that Krishnamurti. So all of these are Asiatic things, you see. So that played its part, but for the West as a whole, as a cultural phenomenon, I can't help thinking it was not helpful. It was helpful for individuals, but as the West as a whole, it was not helpful because it didn't help the West to understand itself. So many people began to say, well, the West, in my generation, what the West has done and the West's spiritual path, which meant Christianity, is all wrong. We have to turn away from all of that. We have to look east. We have to look east in space, and we have to look backwards in time, whether it's backwards to Native American sweat lodges or to Carlos Castaneda and Mexican peyote, whatever it is, or to Tibetan Buddhism. We have to look back in time. We have to look to different parts of the world. We don't look into ourselves as modern Western people or try and understand what Western history has been about. And we don't try and bridge the gulf and understand how all of that Western development relates to the rest of global and particularly Asiatic development. We say, as the Japanese said in the 19th century, Western technology and Asian spirit. And we keep these two things separate in our minds. Just like people like Michael Faraday, who was a good church Christian, a church on Sunday is Christian. He kept Christian church in his mind on Sunday, and he kept his scientific work in the other part of his mind for the rest of the week. Yeah, that's what happened, I think, in for many people in of my generation. We look to Asia for the spirit, and we get our electric guitars out using Western technology, and we rock and roll at Woodstock, and we bring Ravi Shankar on to play his sitar through gigantic speakers. I mean, the completely separate. You see, um, I mean, they might look as if they're together, but actually they aren't. And then we try and rationalize that and say, well, it's all one, man. Robots are cool. Yeah, it's I think it's a fundamental failure, unfortunately, to understand how East and West truly relate. And to really begin to understand how they relate, unfortunately for those folks who may not want, who always say, be here now, forget the past, forget the future, you've got to go back and look at what happened. What happened, how East and West diverged, whether it was in 1054 when the Catholics stopped talking to the Orthodox and vice versa, whether it was in 869 at the Council of Constantinople, where Steiner always talks about, or whether it's in the 4th century and the Council of Nicaea. We need to understand what happened there. And so few people in the West are interested in any of that. They don't realize that those theologians in those church councils, they were the scientists of the time. And because they dismiss Christianity and as a childish superstition, like all the other pagan and the pagan religions as well, they don't look back at those councils and say, how did East and West diverge at that point? Yeah? Because we're still struggling with these divergences today.
And is that at the root of the the antagonism between Russia and uh, the UK, well, England and
Absolutely.
America? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, well, take Ukraine, for example. I mean, the whole of Ukraine, well, Ukraine itself is divided between East and West, right? And it's divided also religiously between East and West. You've got the part of Ukraine in the East, which is Orthodox and owes respect to the Orthodox Church in Moscow, which Zelensky's government is trying to suppress. And then you've got what was used to be called the Uniate Church, which appears to be Orthodox in its rituals and forms, but owes its spiritual obedience to Rome. And you have this long struggle of Rome and what was Constantinople and later became Moscow, of the Eastern and Western, the Catholic tradition versus the Orthodox tradition. And you can't just dismiss that by saying, oh, well, that's just again, these stupid theologians arguing about their dogmas. No, it's about something much more fundamental. It's about the nature of Western humanity, European humanity, the nature of Eastern humanity, going right back to Plato and Aristotle, the time of Plato and Aristotle, when people would say, or people later came to say that Plato, in a certain sense, was the last Asian and Aristotle is the first Greek, and those two can meet each other there as in the 4th century before Christ. And they're in the wonderful painting by Raphael, the School of Athens. And you see the colors that the two men are wearing and the gestures that they are making and even the angle of the books that they're holding. And the contrast is really pointed to beautifully there between the East and the West, towards the heavens and the earth. But this goes back to what you were saying before, Mick, it's about the transformation of the earth and not the desire to escape from the earth. And Asia, going right back to ancient India, there's a sense in which Asia has come down to earth, but in a sense doesn't really want to be here. Its memory of the spirit world, its memory of living together with spiritual beings is maintained still that much more strongly than in the West, that it would still wish to return and not go through this process of transforming the earth. And of course, some people would say, yeah, well, look at the Chinese communists, they're materialists, aren't they? Or Chinese technology, they're materialists, aren't they? Or look at the Indian middle classes and their computer industries, they're materialists, aren't they? Yes, yeah, that's true. But that's in historical terms like the thinnest of icing layers on a cake. That the cake is the cake of Asian spirituality, which has been with us for millennia. And this materialism of India and China is very, very recent. Yeah. What's driving your Indian scientists and computer scientists today is a very, very recent attitudes, I think, in India. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think maybe we'll finish up there in a sec, Terry, but it's been a great long conversation. But and I think we mentioned last time about this role that Central Europe ideally would have as a kind of a bridge. I don't know if that's the right word, but um, Central Europe as a place where something can be cultivated
Mhm.
that can actually balance out the East, what's happening in the Far East and what's happening in the Far West, if you like. But the two world wars, in a sense, came about and largely put a stop to it.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
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 that's right, Mick. And there, I think, again, it's a question of that the thing from the sentence from the Gospel of St. John, you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free, which the words of Christ, right? Which is up there on the CIA, on the wall, the entrance to the CIA, right? It's on their entrance lobby as you go in there. And why am I saying that? Because until we get to understand the truth of the two world wars, then we will not understand, I think, how it is that the Europe was basically destroyed, how and why Europe became destroyed in the two world wars, and how Europe is today not a bridge between East and West, and how Europe is basically squeezed between East and West. And or in a sense, it's not really even between East and West any longer. Most of Europe has been drawn to one side. So how can you be a bridge if you're all standing on the same side, in this case, as America? Yeah. So Europe, or particularly Central Europe, which Anthroposophy came out of, Central Europe is now fully under the control of the West. So how, therefore, can the peoples of the East trust it? And today we have China and Russia and possibly India, but we don't really know which way India is going to jump yet, or if it's going to jump at all, right? But they're in the BRICS together. They're in the BRICS together. Iran is in the BRICS together with those others and many other countries in Asia. So you've got this group, this Asiatic group. Of course, there are other countries like South Africa and Brazil. So it's not only Asia, but China is certainly, I would say, leading the BRICS group. And the symbology, in a sense, of what is represented by the Belt and Road project of the Chinese, yeah, in its movement across Eurasia. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful symbol, really, of what's coming from Asia. And I don't want to be, what's the word? I mean, I'm saying this in no sense to be demonizing or anything like that, but just to look at the parallel, yeah, between 800 years ago with what came with the Mongols from East Asia and what's come from China now. The Chinese are not the Mongols. Absolutely no way. The Chinese saw themselves as civilized. They saw the Mongols as savages. So, they would be insulted if one were to say, well, it's like the Mongols. But I'm just saying that what one sees is that a certain movement, doesn't matter what kind of a movement it is, whether it's a materialist movement like now with the Belt and Road Project, a technological movement, or whether it's a kind of a spiritual cultural movement, or even political or military movement, which is what the Mongols represented. But you see a huge and powerful movement coming from the East in the direction of the West. And then the West somehow has to respond to that. And out of this meeting of the two, and of course, the meeting took place in the 13th century in the Middle East, right? So the Mongols get to the Middle East, not only Europe, they actually were there. Their armies were in the Middle East as well. And now we see China. We see China owning bits of Europe, owning bits of Africa, owning bits of Western Asia, yeah,
And Australia.
and Australia, yeah, developing these places, right? So these are enormous, enormous geopolitical and cultural developments. So I think, yeah, the what's going on there with this development of China is, it's not just a repetition. It's not to be seen in the sense of in a fearful sense, as some people in the West see it, but it's to be seen in another example of this movement from the East calling for a movement from the West, which is there also in the second verse of Steiner's Foundation Stone meditation, by the way, isn't it? Let there be fired from the East what is echoed in the West. The question is, what can that echoing be like? How can that happen in a healthy way? And only if, I think, Europe can play its proper healthy bridging role can Europe be a real healthy bridge between East and West. And that can't happen until Europe gets over its hang-ups and its prejudices about the two world wars and understands how those world wars happened and whose interests those world wars were serving. Because of those world wars, Europe is now in the relatively impotent situation that it finds itself in today, not least in this present war that's going on in Iran and the Middle East, but also, of course, in the ongoing situation in the Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. Yeah? But it was also the case in Yugoslavia. Europe didn't have anything really healthy, truly bridging role to play in the 1990s in Yugoslavia, and it doesn't have any now. And that's because it is largely a puppet of the USA. And the European Union is functioning as a de facto puppet. And if some people point to the current spats and squabbles between Trump and the leaders of the EU, as far as I'm concerned, they are purely temporary. And once Trump has gone and been replaced by somebody who, as the real power brokers in the West intend that he will be replaced by, it will be back to the situation as it was before. The working towards a united Europe, using fear of Russia to create a united Europe, which will be under the umbrella of the USA. And I would just mention one name finally, Mick, which you're probably familiar with yourself, but for your listeners who are interested in these questions of geopolitics and geostrategy, and that's the youngish American former US Marine Brian Berletic, Berletic, Brian Berletic, who has a website and a YouTube channel called The New Atlas. And I think he has a very good view of what's going on in relation to this, the big picture geostrategy wise. So I would certainly encourage people to look at what he's been saying, because he shows from American documents, establishment documents, what the long-term American plans are, and that one shouldn't be sidetracked by what appear to be new developments. Actually, there is continuity of agenda over a continuous long-term agenda, which has to do with the effort to control full spectrum dominance, as it's called, to exercise that and then over the whole world. And that hasn't changed since the 1990s. So even if people think that America is a declining empire, which in some senses it may be seen to be, but nevertheless, declining empires don't easily give up, as we saw with Rome, as we saw with Britain. And that's still the goal for the Americans. And he lays that out pretty well, Brian Beletic.
Okay, well, I just maybe to end on a slightly more hopeful note, I would just, maybe I'll put it as a question that we can leave hanging a little bit, but um, it doesn't look like Europe as a whole or the Central European powers are going to all of a sudden come together and go, oh, hey guys, let's be the spiritual leaders here and be the healthy bridge between East and West. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. So, in a
No,
sense, it has to really come down to individuals and individuals, I think, taking up a spiritual path, but seriously,
yeah,
and also taking up the cultural work involved in that as well. So, there are actually, a lot of Waldorf schools springing up in China now. There's a lot of people in the anthroposophical movement who are going over to China and doing work there. And it's not missionary work. They're being asked by the Chinese
yeah,
to come over and learn from the Europeans' experiences in things like Waldorf education and Camp Hill and things like
yeah,
that. So there is a cultural exchange happening there.
yeah,
Hopefully, it has the depth and the esoteric foundations that are needed. That it's not just surface level, because that way I don't think that'll work. But
yeah.
yeah, maybe just to leave it on that, Terry. What do you think about that? Is that is it's gonna have to come down to individuals? I mean, it's always individuals making decisions anyway, right? Um, Even though there's big behemoths, big countries that are moving in certain directions, individuals
Mm.
are still the ones making the decisions. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
Well, I quite agree with you. Quite agree with you, Mick. And that picture you've got behind you there of Tintagel, I mean, that sort of points us back to that period of the early Christian centuries and uh, in a sense, the end of what you might call Celtic Britain. But Steiner pointed out that the task of the Knights of King Arthur, or the Round Table of King Arthur, was a very um, long running effort of people coming from that particular place to try to help the peoples on the continent to understand themselves and gain more insight into their individualities, I think. And that's what, again, was so important about the fourth century. So it's this freedom impulse, as you say, it has to be done by individuals. But connected with that, I think, Mick, is what was called, again, going back 20 years ago, at the height of that um, rather negative impulse of that imperial 666 impulse, was the truth movement. And this term, the truth movement, yeah, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It's the spiritual path of the individual, but it's also individuals not forgetting what's going on in the world, yeah, and always trying to keep in mind the larger picture of how can we understand to relate individuals in East and West, North and South. So I think trying to understand what's going on in terms of historical truth will also be very important to enable Europe itself to, as it were, return in a certain way to its own autonomy as a cultural sphere, so that it can be the bridge And that requires individuals to, I think, understand history in a new esoteric way, because it's only by taking account of the spiritual forces which have been working in the history of Europe and the world that we will understand the process of both of history and in contemporary events as well.
And an exoteric way too, I think, Terry, because there's so much that's hidden and so many lies at the foundation of
Yeah,
what
yeah,
most people understand happened with the two world wars. And
yeah,
I'd point people towards Rudolf Steiner's lectures under
exactly.
the karma of untruthfulness,
Yeah.
and how they are really almost like a guidebook to modern media in a sense, aren't they? Like
Yeah.
a modern media studies. And so that's where I always point to people on these questions, yeah, because I think it's so important that we at least get another perspective
Hmm.
from just the mainline history version. But Terry, this has been a fantastic conversation for me. Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you, Mick.
there is a big selfish element to this in that I just really like to talk about this stuff with you. But thank you very much for giving up your time. And where can people find you, Terry? Do you want to mention your website where they can find your
Yeah.
writing and
Hmm. Well, I mean, my website is threeman.org. So three man, that's in letters, THREEMAN, one word, threeman.org. That's where you'll find uh, most of my writing. And I have, well, at the moment, I've got three books out. And the fourth one will be coming out next month in April, which will be about Christian Zionism and the founding of the State of Israel. Uh, but the others are, the first one was in 98, which is Mapping the Millennium, Behind the Plans of the New World Order, 1998, that was published. This is the original one. I don't have a copy of this, the second one, the second edition, which came in 2013. But that's still available. And then the second one was about Caspar Hauser. Caspar Hauser, where did he come from? It was 2006. And then the third one was Western hostility to Russia, the hidden background to the war in Ukraine. It was 2023. It's also from Temple Lodge, like the first one. And then I got a couple of, I have a couple of translations, major translations I've done recently. One was by Carl Heyer, Heyer, Carl with a K. Carl Heyer, who's an anthroposophical historian, again about Caspar Hauser and the mission of Middle Europe in the 19th century. Unfortunately, just this weekend, I sold my last copy of that, so I don't have one to show you, but you can find that easily online. It's also by Temple Lodge, by the way. And then in December, this big biography of Lord Stanhope, the British secret agent, who was the adversary of Caspar Hauser, was published also by Temple Lodge. That was originally written by Johannes Meyer. So that's a detailed biography of this British secret agent who played a very significant role in the life and of Caspar Hauser in the early 19th century. And at the moment, I'm working on translation of this book, the Decline of the Habsburg Monarchy and the Future of Middle Europe, by Count Ludwig Polzer-Hoditz, who was one of Rudolf Steiner's closest pupils. And there's a lot in this book about karma of various individuals, such as Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, and so on. So that's this whole situation leading up to the First World War.
Mhm.
Yeah, so those are some of the things I've been doing, and where you can come across my work. And I give talks and lectures here and there.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks very much, Terry. I'll put all the links to your website, etc. And you also write an article fairly regularly with the New View magazine.
Yeah, that's right.
So
Yeah.
I'll put all those links in the description below.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for your time, and I'm sure we'll do it again at some point.
Yeah. Thank you,
And
Mick.
yeah, if I could just say to our listeners and viewers, if you'd like to support this podcast to continue, please go ahead and check out the link in the descriptions below about ways to support the Spiritual Scientist podcast. And we've also got an online group you can join where for those who are interested in discussing Rudolf Steiner's work a little more in depth, but also if you're new to Steiner's work, I've got some things in there that are coming up where we're going to sort of help people to show them where to start, because it can be so overwhelming when you first come across Anthroposophy. Where do I start? There's so many books and lectures. So a little bit of guidance there, but all of that will be in the description below. But thanks again, Terry. Great to speak with you, and see you again soon.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you.